Those of you who attended Craig McNamara's talk last spring about his fraught relationship with his father, Robert McNamara, due to his father's role in the war in Indochina, will recall that he was accompanied by Dr. Larry Berman, an expert on that war. Today, Dr. Berman will tell us a fantastic but true story about the life of Pham Xuan An, who was a spy for the North Vietnamese. Pham was so successful that he was promoted to general, one of only two in North Vietnam's history to receive this honor for espionage. But as is sometimes true of spies, Pham was mistrusted by some in his own government. You can read the story in Dr. Berman's book, Perfect Spy. Dr. Berman is Professor Emeritus in Political Science at the University of California, Davis. He's written extensively on the war in Vietnam, including No Peace, No Honor, Nixon, Kissinger, and Betrayal in Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson War, The Road to Stalemate in Vietnam, and Planning a Tragedy, the Americanization of the war in Vietnam. I've read Lyndon Johnson War and Perfect Spy, both of which I recommend highly. Dr. Berman, I'm delighted to see you again.
Thanks. Thank you. First of all, I want to make sure that this mic is projecting in the back. Okay, yeah. All right, great. I'm going to have to use the keyboard. The remote's not working. So the good news for you is that I'm going to remain stationary and unanimated but going to do my best here. So I am going to tell you the story of Pham Xuan An, but the most important thing I want to talk about is really the arc of his life. The book itself was written in 2000. I'll stay on target. It was written in 2007, and I'm still talking about it for a lot of reasons that I'll share with you today. I can only share with you if. Okay, I'm hitting all of the keys and none of them work. How'd you do that? Oh, with this. Oh, let's see. All right. So, when the computers first got those CD-ROM drives, my level of technology is I thought it was a coffee cup holder. So this involves some really technical skill. All right. So that's why I want those remotes. Anyway, I'm going to talk to you about Pham Xuan An. This is my favorite picture of him. It's the one that is on the jacket cover of the paperback and the cloth edition. Smoking his Lucky Strike cigarettes, which he smoked for 55 years, 5 packs a day. Introduced to smoking by American GIs, and eventually he would die of emphysema. So he said, the Americans finally got me. And he's there with his book about Ho Chi Minh and then his typewriter that he was so fond of. So very briefly, my book has been translated also into Vietnamese. I'm very proud of the fact it's the #1 nonfiction seller in Vietnam. An is a hero in Vietnam, as you might expect of the most heralded spy. Most exciting to me is after optioning this book 5 times, 5 options, selling it to screenwriters who were unsuccessful to get Hollywood to fork over the $20 or $30 million necessary to make a film, because in the old days, who wants to go to see a movie where America gets their ass kicked, right? And the lead protagonist is a Vietnamese guy, right? And this isn't Sylvester Stallone and asking, can we go back and win this time, right? Which is one of the scenes in the first of 5 Rambo, or 4 or 5 Rambo movies. But finally, it's been optioned successfully. The script is in almost its last stages. The director is a Vietnamese American by the name of Charlie Nguyen, really quite successful. I'm really excited. It also brings me to Vietnam quite frequently now. It'll be shot both in Vietnam and in Thailand for worldwide distribution. So really, well, we're very excited about that. Obviously, every historian's dream is, my God, someone should read my book, right? But much less now they're going to have. And by the way, the hardest thing about that, of course, is you got to let it, you have to let it out of your system that they change things in the movie, right? Because there is an arc to the film as well. And so they've taken some liberties in the script, and my job is just to say, oh yeah, good job, where's the check? On that. So why are we seeing this? Oh, okay, I can do that. There we go, thank you. Yeah, all right. So the guy I'm going to talk to you about today, you can read this, I don't read my slides, but really the Vietnam War produced so many astonishing stories and personalities. But I don't think there's anything quite like Time correspondent Pham Xuan An, whose secret life was only uncovered several years after the war. Until then, he was simply known as a brilliant contributor to Time magazine, before that to Reuters, the Herald Tribune, and elsewhere. Friends with CIA country chief William Colby, CIA country chief William Colby, who would later go on to be the CIA director. Friends with the highest fighting non-communist generals in Vietnam. Friends with the presidents of South Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam. Friends with American reporters. His best friends were Neil Sheehan, David Halberstam, and a whole list of people. But he was most of all the most skilled journalist, Vietnamese, who when Americans got there, reporters got there, or people got, whoever was there, An could explain what the hell was going on in the war. He could explain it to them because his English was so good. That's part of the story I'll talk to you. He was trusted by everybody. So here's a couple of examples of all the press passes he had. This is the New York Herald Tribune. This is from MACV, Vietnam Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, 1965. This, I'll tell you how he got to be a spy in a minute. This is just sort of the appetizer, which is that he had access to military command Vietnam, given to him by the Americans. He didn't have to steal anything, all right? And he was welcomed, and he listened, and then he would write his reports. And again, this is just, I'll get to all this. He was very proud of this particular card. It's taken a little after the war. There he is at a press briefing. There on the bottom of my left there. Here he is with Neil Sheehan and a South Vietnamese colonel while he's working for Time magazine. I love this picture, but it was Richard Avedon, a photo that cost a lot of money for the book, to be in the book, highest price photo, because this is Robert Chaplin, the Far East many of you will remember the New Yorker Far East correspondent Robert Chaplin, probably the most astute writer of what was going on in Asia during the war. And here is An whispering into his ear some secrets and the like, or everyone wanted to talk to An because he seemed to know everything about everything. This was a picture I found in the New York Times Sunday magazine of An in the field following a battle. There he is with a cigarette. You'll see many more photos like that. But again, he was hiding in plain sight is what the first message is here. And, you know, after 9/11, I was visited by counterintelligence officers in my office in Davis from Homeland, literally the equivalent of Homeland Security. Why would they do this? This was about 4 years later. Why would they come to see me? What would I ever have to do? Well, I had written a book about the most successful singleton. That's what he's called, a singleton, an undercover agent who works alone in a single cell with some support, and he survived. Most of the Vietnamese spies were killed. They were rooted out. They're dead. Okay, but he survived. And what happened in 9/11 was the attack on us was perpetrated by individuals, which is human intelligence. They had lived amongst us the same way An had lived amongst us. They had worked with us. They had gone to school. They had done all these things here, and they still got in those planes and drove them into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and elsewhere, right? So they wanted to know if An had given me any clues to about being an agent. They didn't want to know what was in the book. They had read the book. They wanted to see all my notes and everything. It's really interesting, and I gladly gave them all of that. Obviously, well, some people might say, no, you should have protected it all. I gave it to them all, and they spent a lot of time going through it. I have no idea, but the book is now used in the even today, because I've gone to the CIA and to Langley and given talks. It's still used today for agents as they're getting their training about how one agent and sort of his techniques and how he did that. Here he is with Francis Fitzgerald, who wrote Fire in the Lake, a Pulitzer Prize winning film, probably the most, still probably one of my most favorite books on Vietnam. And there's An. So An was friends with Time magazine, but An had a secret, right? It was a big secret. No one knew this at all right? And you know, his name is his life, because in Vietnamese, An means hidden and concealed. So he was living his name. It was his life. This was the real Pham Xuan An, or maybe it wasn't, because at the end of this talk, I'll try to convince you that isn't the real Pham Xuan An, okay? But that's what most people today think of when they hear about An. They, you know, the Time magazine reporter who became this general. His reports were so good that General Giap proclaimed, "We are now in the American war room." And indeed, after the war, An was brought up to Hanoi because he was based in Saigon. That's where the Americans were, in Saigon. Hanoi is in the north. He was brought up to Saigon and promoted to the rank of general. And he was told for the first time, because he was in he's in Saigon. He had no communication at all with the North. No one was telling him, hey, this report was great, this report was great. Only after the war did he find out that his reports had contributed specifically to defeat the Americans in about 5 or 6 very specific instances. And he was very good on strategy as well. And he was given all these, what they call exploit medals. Now, when exploit medals. So he was promoted to this rank, and he became this very, very famous person. Everyone wanted to write about him, everybody, all right? And, you know, how did he do it? You know, and David Halberstam, who everyone in the room recalls, died tragically in a car accident, wrote the book, The Best and the Brightest. Halberstam was offered $500,000. This is back in like the early 1990s to write with An's life story, his biography. But An said no, because An didn't want anyone who had known him during the war to tell his story. And he just didn't think that was fair. So I got to write the story, and I got to spend a lot of time with him. I'm going to tell you how I met him, what I did. So I just didn't read the newspapers and say, this is a cool story, I'm going to write about it. I made over 45 trips to Vietnam, spent months and months with An, writing the story as a younger man. Didn't have hair then either, but a younger man. We worked together while his health was good on some days. So this is the first night that I met An in the year 2000 on my very first trip. I wasn't in the war, and my very first trip to Vietnam. As of today, I've made about 71 trips to Vietnam. So, but that was my first night in Vietnam. And I tell the story in chapter 1. Those of you who've read the book know it. If you haven't read the book and you decide to read it, I tell how I met An and just how many things in life are just lucky, and how these things happen. So I was invited to a dinner party. Again, I had just gotten off the plane. We had gone to Cu Chi, a tour for the tunnels, and then we had dinner. And I was with a group of 7 historians who were going to Vietnam for the first time, but we were being led by someone who was in the Navy during the war, had fought in Vietnam, and we had a very good Vietnamese aide. But Jim Reckner was really well connected. So we had a dinner where they invited 7 academics and An to dinner. And we got there, it's a very long table, and everyone's there but An, and I didn't even know who An was. And I'm sitting next to these 2 Vietnamese guys on both sides and across from me, but there's only one empty seat, which is empty, and no one speaks any English, so everything has to be done through a translator, and I'm looking for the beer, saying, "Oh God, this is going to be a long night," right? And all of a sudden, An walks in, and he's like a rock star, a rock star. Everyone in the restaurant gets up, goes to speak to him, and he comes over, and there's only one empty seat. And I heard him speaking English. He said to Jim Reckner, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm late, Saigon traffic." And I go, "English, great." So he sits down right next to me, across from me. I go, "Larry Berman, University of California, Davis." He goes, "Davis, I love Davis. I spent time there. And I wore Eleanor McClatchy from the Sacramento Bee. Do you know her? She was my good friend. I interned in the Sacramento Bee." And he starts telling me what he did. And so we spoke for 3 or 4 hours about all of the time that he spent in America. I'm going to tell you in a second how he got to America. So I still didn't know who he was. I didn't know. I somewhere in my back of my mind, I knew there was a spy whose name was An, but I just didn't put it together. So he asked me what I'm working on. I told him I'm finishing a book on Nixon and Kissinger, but really about the secret negotiations to end the war, which eventually became No Peace, No Honor, which you heard about in the introduction. And he says to me, "I know a lot about that subject. Why don't you come and see me tomorrow at Chivral?" And I said to him, "I'm sorry, I can't, because we're supposed to go to Cambodia the next day. We're going to go to Siem Reap, and we're going to go see the wonders of the world, right? Which, are worth going to." So he goes, "That's too bad," but he gave me his card. And I swear to you, I could take it out now, but time is of essence. I still carry that card in my wallet with me. To this day, it's sort of like a lucky charm. I'm so superstitious. It's just crazy. I said, "I'm sorry," but he gives me his card with his phone number, and he goes, "Well, sorry, we can't do it." So on the way out, Mr. Khan, who is our Vietnamese guide, says, "Do you know who you just spent all this time with?" I go, "The guy's fascinating, man. He lived in California. He went to college here." And he goes, "That's Pham Xuan An." I go, "Who's that?" And so then Khan told me. And so I go back to the hotel room, and I say, "I can't go to Cambodia. I just can't go." And everyone else went to Cambodia. And that morning I went down and I told these guys who I'd only been in Vietnam one night, I said, "I can't go to Cambodia because this guy wants to talk to me about the book I'm writing on. I didn't know I would ever write a biography about him, but he can really help me on this book. And, I'm a historian. I mean, I have plenty of years left to go to Siem Reap." So they all left. And I stayed alone in Saigon for 4 days while they were gone. And I spent every day with An, every single day. And it was just an extraordinary experience. And he taught me a lot, helped me a lot. And at the end of those 4 days, I decided, boy, it would be really great one day to write a book about him. But he said no. I was finishing my book anyway. So I really didn't give it a lot of thought. But then he read that book, No Peace, No Honor, right? He read it. This was like about 3 years later. He read that book. And he thought that I had dealt with the issues from the Vietnamese and American side. He had really helped me see the Vietnamese side. I'm sure he probably was checking to see how well I listened to him, but he thought, and that book is, still, I just spoke in Orange. I just spoke in just the other day about this book somewhere in Southern California, at Chapman University. And during the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, the American involvement in the war, this book was getting a lot of attention still because it's a book about how the war ended. And An liked the book, and I said to him again, would you let me write your biography? And he said no. And I went home. I went home. But then the news came out that An was about to die. He only had a few days left to live. He had lost half of a lung from all that smoking, and basically, these were obituaries that were written in the Vietnamese newspapers. This was a photo that I took from a newspaper. And it just said, "General Pham Xuan An, hero of the revolution," all that communist propaganda crap, right? Hero of the revolution, blah, 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 was about to die. An always thought that he was going to go see the emperor of hell for what he had done. And he had no religious beliefs at all, except that he was going to hell. And he would meet a lot of people there that he knew, is what he told me. All right. So so I wrote An a letter, and I wrote a letter saying to him, you're you're too tough to die. I didn't believe it, but I just said it, and this, wrote a couple of things. I said, if you ever get out of this thing, maybe you'll let me write your story before you really do die. So didn't think he'd ever see it or anything. And about 7 months later, I get contacted. He wants to see me. And he sent a list of 5 books he wanted to read as well, because he was a voracious reader. And I went there, and when I met him this time, instead of meeting where we had always met at the cafe, for the first time I went to his home, and his bedroom was moved downstairs. You can see the oxygen tank there, and that's where he spent every night for the rest of his life. He thought he only had 3 or 4 months to live, but that sucker lived, that great guy lived 2.5 years. And as a result of that, I was able to write this story. So you talk about luck and just being in the right place, the decision not to go to Siem Reap, the decision, write that letter. A lot of things just happened. How lucky I was to be sitting opposite him that night at dinner. So just a lot of things happened. So who was this guy to begin with? All right. So, the most important thing I want to say is that about this is that he was born, he was like middle class. His father was a land surveyor, and he used to take An all over Vietnam. And he wanted An to see how the poor people were suffering under French colonial rule, colonialism, all right? The last thing An was a communist. I'm telling you right that. Now, he was not a communist, even though he joined the Communist Party, all right? He had to join the Communist Party to do what he did, but he was a nationalist. He just believed that no one, the French, the Americans, no one belonged in his country. The future of Vietnam should be determined by the Vietnamese, not foreign occupiers. That's what he thought. And his father took him around, showed him all this. And I was a very poor student in school with one exception. Two exceptions. One, that he was very good in math, but two, he was a linguist. He had a great affinity for languages. He could pick language up just like that. So he failed 3rd grade, had to repeat it, a lot of things, but languages was a real skill of him. So as An is growing up, it's all about the first Vietnamese Revolution. I don't want to spend much time on this, but this is really about getting rid of the French occupation. It's about social liberty, social justice, liberty, and independence. And ultimately, at the Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the French are defeated. A lot of you know all this already. An, during this time, was very active as a militant. There he is carrying a sign in Vietnamese, which basically wants to get rid of the French. And it's interesting, on the day this photo was taken, it was actually a protest because an American ship had docked in Saigon Harbor carrying supplies for the French. And there's An as a young person. He's an activist. That's what he is. He's an activist. But the party was watching him. And when we say the party back then in 1954, 55, we're talking about a bunch of people who had just fought a jungle war. They're coming out. There's no diplomatic offices. These are not advanced diplomats or anything. They're trying to figure out who's going to come next. Who's going to come next? The French are defeated. They're leaving. But all of a sudden, they're looking around. And they're seeing these Americans. Okay, they see General Edward Lansdale and the first OSS, which is the precursors of the CIA. They're arriving in Saigon. The Bank of Vietnam is created. And then they see the Americans are backing this guy by the name of Diem. And they know Diem. And they're seeing all this. And they're wondering, who the hell, we just fought this first war. Who are the Americans? And they don't know. But they're going to find out, because they are going to train An. They're going to bring him into the party. They're going to give him a couple of tests. And then they're going to send him to America. And they're going to send him to America to learn about who the Americans are. Sort of like the Alexander de Tocqueville who wrote that great book on democracy, a Frenchman who came here, went all over, discovered the temperament of the American people. An's job would be to go to America and learn who the Americans were, spend 5 or 6 years here, and come back, because no one would ever envision in 1955, when all this is being planned, one day there would, even the Vietnamese, even An always said, we thought maybe the Americans would come with 5,000 troops, and they'd leave, but No one could envision 550,000 ground troops, 55, 60,000 Americans dead, millions of Vietnamese on both sides, the use of chemical weapons. It was inconceivable at this time, inconceivable to anybody at this time. So the decision is made. So my definition of An is, I won't be moved from this position, although I have been in arguments about this position, which is that he was a Vietnamese nationalist, not a hardcore communist. I'll try to demonstrate this to you in this talk. And this is what he believed. And he was recruited into the party to become a spy. So the decision is made to send An to the US. But a Vietnamese kid, well, he's not a kid, he's a little older than other people, he's about 24, 25 years old at this time. They want to send him to the United States, but they got to get a sponsor, all right? Because you just can't get on a plane and come, and they don't even have the money to send them. So they have to get a sponsor. So this is the first of a lot of things I'll tell you that you'll say unbelievable. They would get the CIA to sponsor them. And the person they got, you can see what a movie, the arc of this. So who was it? This is An. This is during his early days. So they got General Edward Lansdale, the leading anti-communist of the day, had arrived in Saigon to set up the first shop that was going to support American counterinsurgency, support CM, and fight these communists. Well, the first person Lansdale meets is this young guy, Pham Xuan An, who speaks this perfect English and loves him. And Lansdale says to him, would you like to study in America one day? An had been prepping him. And so Lansdale got the sponsorship from the CIA and from the Vietnamese language school, to a CIA front in Monterey. And they would pay the cost of him coming to California to study journalism so that he could then use his skills to combat international communism, all right? And again, he's just, this is so far before his real work as a spy. So he comes, I'm just going to go very quickly. I mean, he was a real, imagine this, he was the first Vietnamese communist in Orange County. Today, the home of the largest Vietnamese American anti-communist group in the world, right? So, but he was the first, and it's interesting because my book signings down there, they ended up into real battles. You communist lover, versus no, nationalism. It's divided by age, So people all of our age, they think he's a communist, he's got blood on his hands. But the younger generation, they think entirely different. He loves sailing in Newport Beach. There he is with his cigarettes. He loved hanging out at the beach. This is the president of OCC, Orange Coast College, where he went. And An was, and this was like, the caption says, "Take me home, An," if you read it small. There he is listening to the American Wi-Fi every night. Hi-Fi, that's not Wi-Fi today, it's Hi-Fi then. He's got his Webster's dictionary there, and he's got his cigarette, and the like. This is one of my favorite photos, because all the way up on the top is Cal Davis, Cal Aggies, and An is circled right over there. He's there attending the student faculty conference. He's just taking it all in. He's learning about American culture. And one of the things that's happening is he falls in love with America, falls in love with our values. He's interning at his job as a journalism major. He works for a newspaper, The Barnacle. And he loves this idea of freedom of the press. He loves everything about being in America, right? And he thinks that when the war is over, he can't wait to go back. There's no war yet. He can't wait to go back and tell his bosses, "Hey, we got a great model accomplish. I got this great model, the USA." But it's a sort of a naive judgment, and the war would intervene, but the dream never ended. And you'll see that momentarily. He falls in love with this woman. I was able to read all their love letters to each other. He made friendships for a lifetime. I interviewed all of his college roommates. It's in the book. some of them prominent, very successful land developers and real estate people in Sacramento, people up here in Sacramento, but also down in Southern California, and they loved An. You know, OCC was a commuter college, and but An every week, kids went home on weekends. An never spent a weekend alone. Everyone wanted to bring An home. And the parents loved him. The stories are all recounted in the book. Plus, he knew how to do things that a lot of American kids didn't do, like, you know, how to cook caterpillars and stuff like that, you know? But he really did love this other issue. He even in the Barnacle reviewed The Quiet American, and which is, you know, Graham Greene's book. And those of you who are familiar with the Graham Greene book, he was really just in the whole thing. Here's my favorite story. He went to Sacramento, and our Governor Edmund G. Brown, gave him an award as the most promising young journalist in America, foreign journalist in America studying, right? So I wish I could share my book with Pat Brown, you know. But so this woman, though, sitting next to him, she's got a great story too. She also received an award, and she was on the Barnacle. So when she got married, she thanked An, how we met, because An introduced her to her husband, but it was a terrible marriage, and they were divorced in a matter of years. And An had told me, and then she told me, so it's a true story. An had asked her to marry him and come back to Vietnam with him. Now, I think it was, what a perfect cover for a spy. You come back with an American wife, right? But she declined that. And I was at a book signing in Newport Beach, and she came up. You see, look, there she is. And then she came up, and she told me the biggest regret in her life was marrying her husband and not marrying An, because she would have been the wife of the world's most famous spy. And I'm still I was in touch with her for many years. It was just great. And I had never met her before, except it was a book signing, and she surprised me. So when it was time to leave Orange Coast, An wrote some very beautiful words. This is where, you know, he learned how to be an American, so to speak. He felt he was living amongst the Vietnamese, the Genesis. He was sad about leaving, but he decided that he would leave after 2 years because there were new opportunities to pursue. And he always dreamed about one day returning to OCC. Reminded me, I wonder if any of their development people ever asked him for money. But so when he left, this gift was given to him. You'll see this gift again in a little while. It's a very special mug, on typing away. He loved being a journalist. And he bought this car. He bought that car, got this California driver's license, got all these maps from his friends, and he kept, this is obviously in later years of his life, he kept all the maps and all the memorabilia of everything that he had done. He drove across the country, took him about 2 weeks, and he never encountered a single problem. The car broke down like 3 or 4 times. People in Iowa took him in. They treated him with love and kindness and respect. He never had a single problem, drove all alone. And he was learning the temperament of the American people, right? Lucky he didn't have to drive across America today. He'd be much different. But back then, and then he arrives in Sacramento, and he goes to, sorry, I screwed that up. Right before he left, the Sacramento Bee did this feature on him, Vietnam journalist aims to fight red propaganda. So his cover is set. It is set. And then this is from Eleanor McClatchy to Pham Xuan An. We are delighted to have had you here at the Bee. I hope that you will return to see us again. With best wishes, Eleanor McClatchy. So he drove across the country, and now he interns at the United Nations. I mean, what a life, right? And he's all undercover, right? It's an undercover. It's being sponsored by Tusor. You know, his real sponsors are the Vietnamese Communists, but his other sponsors are the American CIA, right? So, he gets he gets his ideology from the communists, his money from the Americans. That's about how it works. So he decides in 1959, there's a big crackdown, and a lot of people in the revolution side are getting locked up by Diem. It's a terrible time. And he gets a secret coded message, come home. So he comes home and cuts his trip short. And he gets hired first by Vietnam Press, which is important, but what's more important is he gets hired by this guy, Dr. Tien, Tuyen, the leading anti-communist of the day, who would later then sour on things, but then he was a leading anti-communist. So one of the things An has done now is he comes back to Vietnam. He works for Vietnam Press, which trains Vietnamese journalists, but also issues stories, and he's hired by the leading anti-communist in Vietnam. So he has this ability to attach himself to people who are in lead positions, who have no idea who he is, obviously. Like, you know, I've been several places where people say, well, of course, the Americans, of course he's in journalism. The journalists are so easy to fool. This guy, Pham Xuan An, fooled everybody, intelligence agents on both sides, Vietnamese, Americans. No one ever had any inkling. And so his intelligence work starts immediately. And An would, that's a Cu Chi tunnel, which I'll tell you about. So how did An do it all? So An would go to, he had all these contacts, he would have conversations. He was a strategic agent. He always considered himself a strategic intelligence agent whose job it was to analyze and send reports up, okay? He was not a military strategist. He never wrote a single thing about military strategy. He provided documents. So at night, what he would do is he showed me how he did it. He would write these reports on and visit with ink that would then disappear. And he would have, he and his wife, Tuyen An, would had a camera, and they would take photos of all these documents that he had that were given to him. He never had to steal any of them. And then they would reduce them in size, and there were several ways to do them. But An's favorite way was they would hide the reports in traditional Vietnamese rolls like that, and then An's courier, like this, and they would be wrapped, and then this is his dog, King. They would go to a bird market, and at the bird market, he would meet this woman who was later also promoted to the rank of general. Her name is Baba, but she was, as a younger woman, she was his sole courier. And he would meet with Ba at one of these open air markets, and an exchange would occur, and then she would carry the reports all the way to Cu Chi, where then the communist agents would take them and they would transfer them up via courier or by Morse code or in some way to headquarters. The key here is that, I want to go back. So An was protected by a network known as H63. They started with 55 people whose whole job was to protect one agent. 27 of them were killed during the war. These are four of the surviving people who I got to interview, especially the guy holding my book, Tu Can, who is his own sort of a rock star in Vietnam himself. They took me to the site of where they used to meet, how they used to do it, and I learned quite a bit, too much to tell you. And I spent a lot of time with Baba. She described how An told me he chose her because she chewed betel nut, and her teeth were all blackened, and she drew no attention to herself, whereas other agents would draw attention to themselves. She just looked like a nondescript person who could be, as An did, with the secrets that he was carrying. There's Tu Can, the same guy who was holding my book before. He's a heralded hero in Vietnam today. And so his counterinsurgency work starts immediately. And we don't have enough time for me to go through all the medals, but the first one is he writes a report that will change the outcome of the Battle of Op Bach in January of 1963. It was all based upon the doctrine of counterinsurgency. And An would go to all these meetings, he would get all these documents, and he understood and he analyzed what counterinsurgency meant from the American and the South Vietnamese perspective. The North Vietnamese had no idea what it meant. They sent it all up, and the Battle of Apak was the first test of An's report, and the South Vietnamese suffered severe losses, lost many helicopters, and An became a hero to the North intelligence agents. They said, this is a guy we can really rely on because of what he did at Apak. That's a photo. So when An was about to die, in Vietnamese tradition, An was going to be buried with all his secrets. So his wife took all of his documents and put them there. She got a coffin, and she put the coffin in the house because that's where An would go for about 10 days. Well, there was a period of mourning, and An would be buried with all his secrets. Well, An didn't die. He came back. So An and I would have to go out to the coffin to get documents. So what documents did we have to go? There's a coffin. So you look at these, they're all more confidential and secret. These are all the documents that he had with his notes over them. These are field force documents, order of battle documents, confidential weekly documents. And these are all the ones that An had. This is Combined Intelligence Center Vietnam. And he had all this, and it was just given to him to analyze by other people. People wanted An's take on it. But little did they know that An was going back and writing these reports and sending them up. So the rest of the story is that I'm gonna, because of time, and I want to leave plenty of time for questions. So An would receive 4 really major medals: his contribution at Apak, his reports having to do with the American escalation in 1965, the Tet Offensive, and then the end of the war. And at the end of the war, what he told the Vietnamese was the Vietnamese had suffered severe losses, the North Vietnamese, in the 1972 Easter Offensive is what it was called. And then there were Christmas bombings in January of 1973, and then the Paris Accords are signed. But the Vietnamese, the communists, didn't think they could unite the country until 1977 and 78 because they had suffered severe losses. But An, who's in the South, writes reports that says, are you kidding me? Everyone's decimated. There's no morale. The Americans are losing. Watergate is engulfing Nixon. And now is the time. And they listened to him, and they would, of course, liberate the country in April 30th of 1975. But in An's last act, and the most controversial, Dr. Twin, remember the anti-communist guy who had hired him when he first came back? He was #1 on the list of the North Vietnamese, the most wanted person. If they could get this guy and torture him, they would find everything out. And I have about a 20-page section on this. The movie's going to open, I think, with this section, at least in the script it will. You have An bringing Dr. Twin and getting him fighting through everything and getting him onto the last helicopter to escape. So An is going to get Dr. Twin out because they were friends, and their families had been friends. And An knew what would happen to Dr. Twin if the communists ever got him. He took a great risk because word eventually got out that what An had done, and An was not trusted after that for a long time. And after the war, there's An at one of his weekly meetings, but he's sent to re-education. All right, he's sent to Hanoi for the first time to read all about those leading economic theorists like Marx and others, and An said, it's too late. I've been exposed to the American way of thinking. I believe in American capitalism. I believe in what America stands for. Reading this Marx stuff is ridiculous. So, and An told people this. And so what happened to him? He was put under house arrest for, I put detention here because I don't know where the slides go, and I'd like to go back to Vietnam one day. He was put under house arrest for 7 years. All right, no contact with any outsiders, no Americans, no one. And basically, he just spent this time educating his kids. And what happens is, once Vietnam, which is a basket case by 1983, 84, with 2 major allies, Cuba and the Soviet Union, they've gone to war. Vietnam has gone to war with China. the Third Indochina War. Basically, Vietnam is an economic basket case. There's no electricity, there's no power, there's nothing. All right. And so they reach out under this program known as Des Moines, which is economic liberalization. We're going to embrace economic reforms. We're going to embrace trade and everything else, but we're going to keep our socialist system, which is exactly the way it is today. Vietnam's an Asian tiger, thriving economically, but they still have the same government. So what happens when Vietnam first opens up in 1988, 89, everyone wants to come back and see An. First is Chaplin comes back. Remember the picture of An whispering in his ear? Here is the first one. Then Stanley Cloud comes and they go to see his old Renault. That's still there. Colby comes back, sees An twice. This was the only meeting that An wouldn't tell me what they discussed. He goes, I can't tell you what he thought. They go, that's business. Jermaine Swanson came back. These two veteran friends of mine who I took back, they came to see An to have things explained. And the thing is that everyone wants to know An's story. And then the story takes a really amazing turn because An, don't forget, had studied in America. His dream was that all Vietnamese should be able to study in America. An had asked to come to America, was asked to come to America 5 times, but 2 times in particular to give a major address. And the government refused to let him out. They refused to let him out because they didn't trust him. Now, of course, this is the way it is in the communist system, right? Exploit meadows, heroes, et cetera, but we don't trust you, so we're going to keep you here. You can't leave. So An cut a deal with him. An would agree to continue his analytic work with respect to Vietnam's new #1 enemy, China. All right. So An would analyze all these top secret Chinese documents, which he did until the day he died, because of course even today, China and Vietnam tensions are really high, and things have never been better with the United States. But in return for An supporting, for doing all this work for the government on China, he wanted his son, he's known as Young An, to be able to come to America and be educated. And so he would come to America, go to Duke University first, and then University of North Carolina, and then Duke for his law degree. The journalists, it's all in the book, raised over $30,000 to fund it. And so Young An was able to come to America. But the story gets even stranger. So when President Bush, now remember who we're talking about here, the top-ranked, most heralded Vietnamese spy in America's firstborn son is picked as the translator for President Bush during the first meetings of when this historic first meeting occurs. And I met Young An in Washington, D.C. He was staying at the Willard Hotel, and Bush he had this penchant for giving everyone a nickname. And Young An calls me and he goes, "Larry, I got a nickname. And here, there's An right there, so he's translating there. So the youngest son, and An was very happy about that. And now here's his son again. There's a son right there. Now I want to just begin to close by telling you this. So what is this a picture of? This is a picture of the day the USS Vandergrift, the very first United States naval vessel to return to Saigon since the war, arrived. It arrived. And who is the VIP guest with the American Consul General, Emi Yamaguchi, and the captain, Captain Rogers? It's An and his son. And anyone, I used to run an intern program for the University of California. I always tell my students, get in any picture you can. That's an intern. I have no idea, but I made him famous. He's in the book, etc. But he's in the photo, and I tried to get him out, but like Roger's arm would disappear, and he'd lose a stripe. It wouldn't work. So anyway, but An is there. Why is An there? It's because An had worked for reconciliation from the moment the war ended. All An could talk about was how good the Americans were. and how their system of education in particular and of journalism worked. And it's what Vietnam should embrace. But of course, after the war, the North Vietnamese were never going to do that. But on the ship, there's a very funny story An told me where a Vietnamese colonel comes over to him right after this photo. You can see An is wearing civilian attire. And he says to An, which side were you a general for? And An laughed because he had a great sense of humor. He goes, both sides. And the Vietnamese colonel like froze, didn't know how to respond. And then An said, just kidding. And then he said, see, to me, he goes, they still don't know who I really am. And so An eventually died, and he had asked in his, again, it only works in communist regimes. He asked for a small family funeral, no state funeral, didn't want to be buried in the cemetery of martyrs, etc. But that went unheard. And he had a state funeral, and here's An with all of his medals. This is his house. But look what's there in the journey to the next life, which in Buddhism, the journey to the next life. So An has got the nourishment for the next life, his medals, but his wife had put that cup there as well. The joss candles are there, and then all these flowers came in. With our deepest gratitude for your counsel and encouragement from the Fulbright Economics Teaching Program, to our beloved Pham Xuan An, we'll always cherish your wisdom and friendship from the Vietnam program at Harvard, in admiration and loving memory of Pham Xuan An from the Sheehan family. So I'm going to close by saying I went to An's grave. There he is with all the other heroes, generals, etc. And he's surrounded by the three symbols by which he lived his life. One is fish, fish, because fish never speak. Dogs, because they're forever loyal, no matter how poor you are, no matter what kind, no matter how bad they are, a dog will always love you. Loyalty, because An always believed he was loyal by coming back to Vietnam. He could have stayed in America. He could have made a life, but he went back. He thought he was a role model for the Vietnamese. And finally, a bird, the dog, and then the bird, the bird somewhere on there. But the bird, because you're free. And An explained this to me in great length, because he always believed, as he wrote in the Barnacle, one day he dreamed of being a free swallow flying back to Orange Coast College. And he held that dream for the longest period of time. So I think we have time for a few questions. I'll wrap up by just saying, I haven't done him justice. I tried to get it all in 35 minutes. I got it in 45. But to answer one question someone should ask me, yes, An was responsible for the death of many Americans. Yes, yes, yes. Do I admire him for that? No. Do I understand it? Yes. I understand it because he was protecting his country the same way I would do the same here. Who was the invader in Vietnam? First the French, then the Americans. As An said, all he wanted to do was have the Americans leave. So yeah, An was responsible for the deaths of lots of people. I deal with it in the book. I had a very difficult conversation with him about it. It's discussed, but I understand why he did it, and I'm not angry about it. But that's the decision I made. I made it a long time ago, and he was fighting for his country, and and the way the communists treated him after the war proves to me that he was not a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, not an ideologue at all, and what he wanted for his son was another indication as well. So, can I take any questions? Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Is it on? What was the relationship, or was there a relationship between Ho Chi Minh and An?
There was none. There was no relationship between him and Ho. He admired Ho. He had read about Ho, but he never even mentioned ever meeting Ho. So I don't think he ever met Ho Chi Minh. No, because also An was in the South and Ho was in the North, so he never met him. Yeah, but he like all Vietnamese, he honored him.
You knew Frank McCullough, who was the Saigon bureau chief.
Frank's
for
featured in the
time.
book. I was just reading outside
Yeah,
in my acknowledgments. I used to go visit Frank down at this.
yeah. Well, I was privileged to work for him when he was managing editor of the
Yeah,
Sacramento
Great
Bee,
guy.
and he spoke about On often, and very as a journalist, as an extremely accomplished journalist.
Well, thank you. So I went up to the University of Reno where Frank's papers are, and I found a lot about On in Frank's papers. And I would see Frank both in his home, and then when he went to the retirement home, he and his wife would always host me. So yes, great guy. And Frank's another one who his letter about On is in here, saying how after the war when he was trying to Frank supported young On coming to America and wrote a really beautiful letter in support of that. Yes.
It sounds to me like he's more an analyst than an intelligence agent, not in the sense that Kim Philby was an agent. I mean, Kim Philby had access to all the state secrets and revealed them. I mean, he's reading confidential stuff. Confidential is pretty low level stuff. So he's taking what's available to a lot of people, analyzing it and feeding it. So I'd see him almost more as a strategic analyst.
Yeah, well, he called himself a strategic intelligence analyst. He told me his model was, again, it's in the book, his model was, he modeled himself after Sherman Kent, who was also an analytical intelligence agent who in the old days was sort of the hero of the agency. So thank you, that was a good clarification. Sometimes I go so fast, I don't make that clarification, but thank you.
One more question.
And I would like you to share something with you that I
just-
forgot to share.
Oh, I just want to know if his son is settled in the US.
No, his son studied here, went back to Vietnam, worked for the Vietnamese foreign ministry for several years, and now is actually in private business. Totally left politics, left everything. Wants no part of it. But was very helpful to me as I wrote the book. Two stories I forgot to tell you. I know we have to close. One is that in An's marriage, the party had arranged for An to marry someone, and An rejected that. And he married Tu Nan, that's her name, Tu Nan, because he had met her and fallen in love with her. And he would not, and that was the effect of him spending all this time in America. He just wasn't going to let the party pick his wife for him. And anyway, I don't think we have time for me to read it, but after the book was written, she wrote me an email, and that email is reproduced on my website. So I'd ask you all to read that if you have a chance. And there's no time for me to read the rest of it. I would say that his life is the arc of his life is such that one can come in at any time and interpret his life in any number of ways. You can see him like I see him, or you can see him the way you see him. I think all of these are really, really legitimate. Sort of the biggest criticism of me and the book has been, and it's only from the smallest group, but I understand why it is that I seem to admire An, that I seem to admire how he did all this. And I guess that's right. I mean, I can't say that's not correct. But that's also because I view the war the same way he viewed it, which is we shouldn't have been there. And so if you begin from that premise, I think you almost end up on his side. But if you view it in the other way, then I think you see it differently, and it's the way history is lived. And so thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.